You exhaust yourself saying yes to every request, yet somehow you're still not respected or valued in your workplace. Every day you bend over backwards to keep everyone happy, sacrificing your own priorities and principles, while watching more assertive colleagues advance past you and command the respect you desperately seek. I am Niccolò Machiavelli, and I learned the hard way that the pursuit of universal approval leads only to universal disrespect. In my years navigating the treacherous courts of Renaissance Italy, I discovered that those who try to please everyone end up serving no one, effectively least of all themselves. The political strategies I'll share will transform how you approach relationships and power dynamics, showing you how to command genuine respect while maintaining your integrity. Whether you're managing Renaissance city-states or modern office politics, the principles of strategic influence remain devastatingly effective. But first, like this video, subscribe for more Machiavellian wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to see which corners of the world are ready to stop being doormats and start commanding respect. Let me tell you about the day I learned that trying to please everyone guarantees you will serve no one, not even yourself. It was November 1512, and I held the letter that would change everything I thought I knew about power, influence, and human nature. The parchment felt heavier than its physical weight suggested. Niccolò Machiavelli, it read, "You are hereby dismissed from your position as Second Chancellor of the Florentine Republic." 14 years of dedicated service ended with a few cold sentences. But this wasn't just any dismissal. This was the consequence of my greatest mistake, believing that I could navigate the treacherous waters of Renaissance politics by keeping everyone happy. I had spent years trying to maintain relationships with every faction in Florence. When the Medici supporters whispered their concerns, I nodded sympathetically. When the Republican loyalists voiced their fears, I assured them of my commitment. When foreign ambassadors pressed for favorable terms, I sought compromise that would offend no one. I thought I was being diplomatic, strategic, even wise. How wrong I was. The Medici family had returned to power, and they needed someone to blame for the previous regime's failures. Who better than the man who had tried to serve all masters? My attempt to remain neutral, to keep everyone satisfied, had made me the perfect scapegoat. I belonged to no faction because I had tried to belong to all of them. Standing in my modest office, surrounded by the documents of countless diplomatic missions, I realized the bitter truth. My people-pleasing had made me powerless. The very quality I thought made me valuable, my willingness to accommodate, to seek consensus, to avoid conflict, had rendered me expendable. But worse than losing my position was losing my reputation. The Republicans saw me as a Medici sympathizer because I had tried to work with them. The Medici supporters saw me as a Republican holdover because I had served the previous regime faithfully. In trying to be everything to everyone, I had become nothing to anyone. That night, as I walked through the empty corridors for the last time, I made a vow that would reshape not only my understanding of power, but eventually change how leaders think about influence itself. I would study why this happened. I would understand the mechanics of power, the reality of human nature, and the strategic principles that separate those who command respect from those who desperately seek approval. My fall from grace became my greatest education. The letter of dismissal was not my ending, it was my beginning. What I learned in the months and years that followed would eventually be distilled into principles that leaders still use today to command genuine respect rather than shallow approval. Asterisk. My exile from Florence forced me into a world I had only observed from the periphery, the glittering, dangerous court of the Medici family. Here, stripped of my official position, I became an invisible observer of power in its rawest form. What I witnessed shattered every assumption I had held about leadership, influence, and human nature. The Medici Palace was a theater of ambition where every gesture carried weight. Every conversation held multiple meanings, and every relationship was a calculated investment. I watched as Giovanni de' Medici, later Pope Leo X, commanded absolute attention when he entered a room. Men who had ignored my carefully crafted diplomatic overtures now hung on his every word, not because he sought their approval, but because he had never needed it. I remember one particular evening when a minor Florentine noble approached Giovanni, desperate to curry favor for a failing business venture. The man practically prostrated himself, offering excessive compliments and promising unwavering loyalty. Giovanni listened with polite disinterest, then simply nodded and moved on. The desperate noble's face flushed with humiliation as courtiers smirked behind their wine goblets. Later that same evening, I watched as Giuliano de' Medici, Giovanni's brother, handled a similar request completely differently. When another merchant approached with a business proposition, Giuliano listened intently, asked pointed questions, and either accepted or declined based purely on merit. There was no begging involved, no elaborate flattery required. The merchant left either satisfied with a deal or respectfully disappointed with a clear rejection. The difference was striking. The first noble had approached from a position of desperation, seeking approval and validation along with business. The second merchant had approached as an equal, presenting value and expecting a business decision. Giovanni and Giuliano responded. To the energy they received, desperation bred contempt, while confidence bred respect. I began to understand that the Medici family's power didn't come from being loved by everyone. In fact, they were often feared, occasionally despised, but always respected. They had mastered something I was only beginning to grasp: the strategic deployment of approval and disapproval as tools of influence rather than emotional needs. Watching the court dynamics night after night, I noticed a pattern. Those who constantly sought validation were granted audiences but never influence. Those who offered value without desperation were welcomed as allies. The people-pleasers became entertainers at best, obstacles at worst. The principled negotiators became partners. I saw my former self in every desperate courtier who laughed too loudly at weak jokes, who agreed too quickly with obvious statements, who offered their services before being asked. They were mirror images of my own failed approach to politics, and they were all equally powerless. The Medici court became my classroom in human nature. Every interaction taught me that respect and fear were far more valuable currencies than affection and approval. I was learning to see through the illusions I had created about how power actually works. And the education was as humbling as it was enlightening. The most devastating revelation came when I realized that my fundamental understanding of leadership was not just wrong, it was backwards. I had believed that the path to influence lay in making everyone comfortable, in being the person who never caused conflict, who always found the middle ground. What I discovered in the Medici court was that this approach guaranteed mediocrity and irrelevance. Let me share what I learned about what I now call the prince's paradox. The leader who tries to be loved by all will be respected by none, while the leader who is willing to be disliked by some can earn genuine loyalty from others. I watched this play out repeatedly in the palace corridors. Lorenzo de' Medici, the family patriarch, would make decisions that inevitably disappointed certain factions. When he allocated resources to one project, others went unfunded. When he supported one policy, competing interests were naturally frustrated. But here's what fascinated me. Rather than apologizing or trying to soften the blow, he owned his decisions completely. I remember overhearing a conversation where a group of silk merchants complained bitterly about new trade regulations Lorenzo had implemented. They expected sympathy, perhaps even a reversal of policy. Instead, Lorenzo explained his reasoning clearly, acknowledged their concerns without validation, and stood firm. Those merchants left angry, but they also left with a clear understanding of where they stood. Some even began adapting their businesses to work within the new framework rather than against it. This was the opposite of everything I had practiced. As second chancellor, when faced with competing interests, I had sought compromises that left everyone partially satisfied, but no one truly supported. I had believed that partial satisfaction from all was better than complete satisfaction from some and disappointment from others. I was wrong. The people pleaser's compromise pleases no one because it serves no one's actual interests fully. It's a lukewarm solution in a world that demands hot and cold decisions. Lorenzo's approach was different. He identified which outcomes truly mattered, made decisions that served those priorities completely, and accepted that some people would be unhappy with the results. What surprised me most was how this approach actually increased loyalty among his supporters. When people knew that Lorenzo would stand behind his decisions, they felt more secure in allying with him. When I had constantly sought consensus and compromise, my allies never knew if I would abandon our agreements to appease opponents. The paradox became clear. Trying to keep everyone happy made me unreliable to everyone. Making clear, principled decisions, even unpopular ones, made leaders trustworthy to those who mattered most. I began to understand that effective leadership requires a fundamental choice. You can seek universal approval and achieve universal irrelevance, or you can make strategic decisions about whose respect truly matters and work to earn that respect through consistency and strength rather than accommodation and weakness. This realization would form the cornerstone of everything I would later write about power and influence. The prince who needs everyone's love will never have anyone's respect. Asterisk. Nothing prepared me for my encounter with Cesare Borgia, the man who would become my most instructive and most disturbing teacher about the reality of power. If the Medici court showed me the limitations of people-pleasing, Borgia showed me what happened when someone completely abandoned the need for approval in pursuit of results. I met Cesare in 1502 when I was sent as an envoy to his camp during his conquest of the Romagna. I expected to find a brutal tyrant, and in many ways I did. But what I didn't expect was to find a man whose effectiveness was undeniable, whose loyalty from his followers was absolute, and whose strategic thinking was devastatingly clear. The first thing that struck me about Borgia was how little he cared about being liked. When subordinates brought him problems, he didn't soften his responses or cushion his criticism with false praise. If someone had failed, he said so directly. If a strategy was flawed, he explained why without diplomatic pleasantries. If difficult decisions needed to be made, he made them quickly and moved on. Yet his soldiers adored him, not because he was kind to them, but because he was effective for them. He won battles, which kept them alive. He secured resources, which kept them fed and equipped. He made clear decisions, which meant they never faced the confusion and delay that kills armies in the field. His harshness in small matters translated to protection in large ones. I watched Borgia handle a situation that would have paralyzed me with indecision. A trusted captain had been secretly negotiating with enemy forces, offering to betray Borgia's position in exchange for gold and safe passage. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. In my former role, I would have spent weeks gathering more proof, seeking consultation, building consensus for action. Borgia acted within hours. He invited the captain to a private dinner, confronted him with the evidence, and when the man's denials rang false, had him arrested immediately. The execution took place the next morning, in full view of the army. It was swift, public, and unambiguous. The message was clear to everyone. Betrayal would be met with immediate and severe consequences. But what fascinated me was the reaction of the other officers. Rather than fear for their own positions, they seemed more secure. They knew exactly where they stood and what was expected of them. The clarity was liberating. This was the lesson I had missed entirely in my people-pleasing approach. When you avoid difficult decisions to maintain comfort, you create uncertainty that is far more destructive than temporary discomfort. When you fail to address problems directly because you don't want to upset people, you allow those problems to grow until they threaten everyone. Borgia's willingness to be disliked by some people, Levin, feared by them, created an environment where loyal people could thrive. His refusal to tolerate betrayal meant that genuine loyalty was rewarded and protected. His directness in communication meant that people could trust what he said and plan accordingly. I don't advocate for Borgia's extremes, but I learned something crucial from watching him. The leader who is unwilling to disappoint anyone will eventually fail everyone. Sometimes the most caring thing you can do is to make the hard decision that some people will hate, but that serves the greater good. The sword Cesare carried wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of decisiveness, of the willingness to cut through comfort and consensus to reach effective action. Asterisk. My education in the futility of people-pleasing reached its crescendo during my diplomatic missions to foreign courts. As Florence's envoy, I was tasked with securing favorable terms while maintaining relationships, mandate that seemed reasonable until I encountered negotiators who understood what I was only beginning to learn about the strategic use of approval and disapproval. I remember my mission to the court of Louis XII of France in 1504. I arrived with detailed instructions to secure military support while avoiding any commitments that might anger our other allies. In essence, I was expected to get everything while giving nothing definitive, the people-pleaser's impossible dream. The French court was unlike anything I had experienced. These were not Renaissance Italians dancing around each other with elaborate courtesy. These were direct, practical politicians who viewed diplomatic relationships as business transactions. When I presented Florence's request for military assistance, the French minister asked a simple question: "What exactly are you offering?" In return, I began with the diplomatic language I had perfected over years of trying to keep everyone happy. I spoke of mutual friendship, shared interests, and the value of maintaining positive relationships. The minister listened politely, then repeated his question with slight impatience. I elaborated on the strategic benefits of supporting Florence, the historical precedents for cooperation, and the importance of regional stability. By the third repetition of his question, I realized I was failing spectacularly. The French wanted concrete commitments, specific benefits, clear terms. My attempt to provide maximum flexibility while minimizing risk was seen as offering nothing while asking for everything. I was negotiating like a people-pleaser instead of like an equal partner. The turning point came when I observed a Venetian ambassador negotiate a trade agreement the following week. When the French presented their terms, he didn't rush to accommodate or seek middle ground. Instead, he said, "These terms don't work for Venice. Here's what we can offer instead." He presented an alternative that clearly benefited Venice while providing specific advantages to France. When the French countered, he either accepted, rejected, or modified based on Venice's interests, not on his desire to be liked. The difference was stark. The Venetian ambassador was willing to walk away if the terms weren't right. This willingness to disappoint gave him power I had never possessed. Because he wasn't desperate for approval, he could negotiate from strength. Because he represented his interests clearly, the French could respect his position even when they disagreed with it. I learned that day that saying no strategically was far more powerful than saying yes desperately. When you're unwilling to disappoint anyone, you lose the ability to truly serve anyone. The Venetian secured a favorable deal because he was prepared to accept an unfavorable reaction. I returned to Florence with vague promises and diplomatic pleasantries that committed no one to anything meaningful. This experience taught me that boundaries aren't barriers to good relationships, They're the foundation of genuine respect. When you stand for something specific, people know how to work with you. When you try to stand for everything simultaneously, you become impossible to trust, because no one knows what you'll actually defend when tested. The diplomatic seal I carried represented Florence's authority to make binding commitments, but without the willingness to make those commitments clearly and defend them firmly. The seal was worthless decoration. Asterisk through my failures and observations, I began to understand what the ancients called the relationship between fortune and virtue, though my interpretation would prove quite different from traditional wisdom. The people-pleaser's fundamental error is believing that accommodation will protect them from fortune's wheel, when in reality, it guarantees they will be crushed beneath it. I watched this dynamic play out countless times in the fluctuating politics of Renaissance Italy. Those who tried to remain neutral in every conflict, who sought to please all sides in every dispute, inevitably found themselves powerless when circumstances demanded decisive action. They became victims of events rather than shapers of their destiny. Consider what happened during the War of the League of Cambrai. Florence faced pressure from multiple directions. The Pope wanted our support against Venice. The French demanded loyalty to their cause, and the Holy Roman Emperor expected cooperation with his campaigns. My instinct, my people-pleasing instinct, was to find a way to satisfy everyone, partially while committing to no one completely. But I had begun to learn from my studies of effective leaders. Instead of trying to navigate between all pressures, I recommended that Florence choose the alliance most likely to succeed and commit to it fully. This meant disappointing several powerful parties, but it also meant having genuine influence with the party we supported. The people-pleaser believes that keeping options open preserves power. What I discovered is that keeping options open actually eliminates power. When you won't commit to anyone, no one will commit to you. When you try to serve multiple masters, you become valuable to none of them. I began to understand that fortune favors those who adapt their approach strategically, rather than those who maintain the same accommodating stance, regardless of circumstances. There are times when diplomacy serves your interests, and times when firmness serves them better. The key is reading the situation accurately and responding appropriately, not reflexively seeking the path of least resistance. I learned this lesson personally when dealing with the Soderini government. Piero Soderini, Florence's leader, was a chronic people-pleaser who believed that gentle persuasion and compromise could solve every problem. When faced with growing threats from the Pope's armies, Soderini continued trying to negotiate middle ground that would offend no one. I watched as his approach, which had worked during peaceful times, became catastrophically ineffective under pressure. The Pope interpreted Soderini's accommodating stance as weakness. Foreign powers saw Florence as unreliable because we wouldn't take clear positions. Our own citizens lost confidence because leadership seemed indecisive when decisiveness was desperately needed. The wheel of fortune had turned, but Soderini continued using peaceful time strategies in wartime circumstances. His inability to adapt his approach to changed conditions ultimately led to his downfall and, ironically, to my own dismissal when the Medici returned. This taught me that effective leaders must be like water, taking the shape required by their container while maintaining their essential nature. The people-pleaser tries to be the same in all containers, which means they're appropriate for none of them. Fortune will always test your ability to adapt. If your only strategy is accommodation, you'll be destroyed when accommodation becomes weakness. If your only strategy is confrontation, you'll be isolated when cooperation becomes necessary. True virtue lies in the wisdom to know which approach serves your deeper purposes in each specific situation. Asterisk. The most profound lesson of my political education came when I realized that effective influence requires mastering two completely different approaches: the direct force of the lion and the subtle cunning of the fox. The people pleaser's fatal flaw is believing that only one approach exists. Perpetual accommodation, when success actually demands the wisdom to know when to roar and when to be clever. I first understood this watching Pope Julius II, a man who embodied the lion principle completely. When he wanted something, he demanded it openly and backed his demands with unmistakable force. When the Bolognese resisted his authority, he didn't send diplomatic envoys to negotiate compromise. He marched his army to their gates and demanded submission. His directness was terrifying, but it was also highly effective because it eliminated ambiguity about his intentions and capabilities. Yet, I also observed the fox approach in action through my study of Ferdinand of Aragon, who achieved his goals through strategic misdirection and careful positioning. When Ferdinand wanted to expand Spanish influence in Italy, he didn't announce his intentions openly. Instead, he crafted alliances that served his purposes while appearing to serve his allies' interests. His methods were subtle, but they were equally effective because they achieved objectives while minimizing direct confrontation. The people pleaser uses neither approach effectively. They're not direct enough to be lions. They soften their positions, qualify their demands, and seek consensus even when swift action is required. But they're also not strategic enough to be foxes. They reveal their desperation for approval, making them easy to manipulate and impossible to respect. I learned to recognize when each approach was appropriate through painful experience. During my negotiations with Cesare Borgia, I initially tried my usual accommodating stance, seeking win-win solutions that would please everyone. Borgia responded to this with contempt, correctly identifying it as weakness. Only when I shifted to direct, lion-like communication stating Florence's interests clearly and backing them with real consequences did he begin to take me seriously as a negotiator. Conversely, when dealing with the complex web of Italian politics surrounding the Papal States, direct confrontation would have been suicide for Florence. Here, fox-like approaches proved essential, building coalitions quietly, timing announcements strategically, and positioning Florence's interests within frameworks that appeared to serve broader regional stability. The key insight was that both approaches require strength and strategic thinking. The lion's directness isn't mere aggression, it's the calculated use of clarity and force when those tools serve your objectives best. The fox's subtlety isn't mere manipulation, it's the intelligent deployment of patience and positioning when those tools are more effective than direct confrontation. People pleasers fail at both because they're motivated by the desire to be liked rather than the desire to be effective. They're never direct enough to command respect through strength, and never strategic enough to achieve influence through positioning. They exist in a weak middle ground that serves neither purpose effectively. I began to practice switching between these modes consciously. When dealing with subordinates who needed clear direction, I became more lion-like, decisive, unambiguous, willing to disappoint if necessary. When navigating complex political situations that required careful maneuvering, I became more fox-like, patient, strategic, focused on long-term positioning rather than immediate approval. The medallion I carried bore both symbols as a reminder that true power requires mastering seemingly contradictory approaches and having the wisdom to deploy each when circumstances demand it. Asterisk. The most dangerous revelation of my political education was understanding that the very desire for universal approval makes you a target for those who understand power better than you do. What I discovered was nothing less than a conspiracy not of individuals, but of systems and human nature itself designed to exploit and neutralize those who desperately seek validation from others. I witnessed this conspiracy in action during the Pazzi plot against the Medici in 1478, years before my own political downfall, but something I studied extensively. The conspirators didn't target Lorenzo de' Medici, because he was evil or incompetent. They targeted him because he was effective and independent. But here's what fascinated me. They recruited their inside accomplices not from among Lorenzo's enemies, but from among those who desperately wanted his approval and felt they weren't receiving enough of it. Francesco Salviati, the Archbishop of Pisa, joined the conspiracy partly because he felt slighted by Lorenzo's failure to show him sufficient favor. Salviati had spent years trying to curry approval from the Medici family, and his frustration at not receiving the recognition he craved made him vulnerable to manipulation by those who promised him greater status and validation. This pattern, repeated throughout Renaissance politics, the people most easily turned against effective leaders weren't their obvious enemies, but their approval-seeking allies who felt insufficiently appreciated. The conspiracy against approval wasn't orchestrated by any single mastermind. It was the natural result of human psychology and political reality. I began to understand that when you need approval from others, you give them power over you that they didn't ask for and often don't want. Your desperation for validation becomes a weakness that more strategic minds will exploit, not necessarily out of malice, but simply because opportunity presents itself. In my own career, I had made myself vulnerable to this same conspiracy. By constantly seeking approval from all factions, I had signaled that my loyalty was conditional and my principles were negotiable. When circumstances changed and those factions needed someone to sacrifice, I was the obvious choice precisely because I had never established strong enough boundaries to make myself indispensable to any particular group. The conspiracy operates through several mechanisms I learned to recognize. First, approval seekers are given just enough validation to keep them hoping for more, but never enough to satisfy them completely. This creates a perpetual state of need that can be manipulated indefinitely. Second, their willingness to compromise their stated principles for acceptance demonstrates that they can't be trusted to maintain consistent positions under pressure. Most insidiously, the conspiracy convinces approval seekers that their accommodation is actually a virtue. They're told they're diplomatic, collaborative, and easy to work with. Meanwhile, they're systematically excluded from real decision-making because everyone understands. They'll agree to whatever maintains their access to the group. I watched this dynamic destroy numerous promising careers in Florence. Talented individuals would enter politics with genuine skills and good intentions, but their need for approval would gradually corrupt their effectiveness. They would begin making decisions based on what would be popular rather than what would be effective. They would avoid taking positions that might create enemies, which meant they also avoided taking positions that might create meaningful change. The secret council chambers, where real decisions were made, never included the desperate approval seekers. Even when they held official titles that should have granted them access, power recognizes power, and those who give away their autonomy in exchange for validation are not seen as powerful regardless of their formal positions. Breaking free from this conspiracy requires a fundamental shift in how you think about relationships and influence. Instead of asking, how can I make them like me? You must learn to ask, how can I provide value while maintaining my essential principles? Instead of seeking approval, you must focus on earning respect through consistent competence and clear boundaries. The conspiracy against approval is real. It's pervasive, and it's designed to keep you powerless while making you feel included. Recognition is the first step toward liberation. My transformation from people-pleaser to strategic thinker required building what I came to understand as internal fortifications, psychological walls that could withstand the siege of external pressure while allowing selective access to worthy allies. This lesson came most clearly during my time defending Florence at the fortress of San Miniato, where I learned that physical and psychological defense operate on identical principles. The siege taught me that walls without clear principles behind them are merely obstacles. But walls built on solid foundations and manned by disciplined defenders become sources of strength that enable strategic action rather than reactive accommodation. The people pleaser has no such fortifications. Every external pressure finds immediate access to their decision-making center. I remember the moment this analogy crystallized. Standing on the ramparts of San Miniato, watching enemy forces probe for weaknesses in our defenses, I realized I had spent my entire political career with open gates. Every request, every criticism, every suggestion of disapproval had immediate access to my core decision-making processes. I had no filters, no screening mechanisms, no criteria for determining which external influences deserved consideration and which should be rejected outright. The fortress taught me that good defenses aren't about isolation, they're about control. We didn't keep everyone out. We controlled who came in, when they came in, and what they could access once inside. We had clear protocols for distinguishing between allies and enemies, between legitimate concerns and manipulation tactics. I began developing similar protocols for my internal life. Instead of automatically accommodating every request for my time, energy, or agreement, I created criteria for evaluation. Did this request align with my core principles? Did it serve objectives I had consciously chosen? Was the person making the request someone whose judgment I genuinely respected, or were they simply skilled at triggering my approval-seeking responses? The fortification process required identifying my core principles first. I had to understand what I actually believed, what I was willing to defend, and what I considered non-negotiable. This was surprisingly difficult. Years of people-pleasing had left me unclear about my own authentic positions on many issues. I had become so accustomed to molding my opinions to match my audience that I had lost track of what I genuinely thought. I established what I called inner citadel's core, beliefs and principles that would remain constant regardless of external pressure. These included my commitment to Florence's independence, my belief in competent governance over popular governance, and my conviction that effective leadership sometimes required unpopular decisions. Having these citadels clearly defined gave me reference points for evaluating requests and pressures. The fortification also required developing what military strategists call defense in depth. Instead of making decisions in the moment of being asked, I created protocols for strategic delay. When someone requested something that might compromise my principles or priorities, I learned to say, "Let me consider that and respond tomorrow." This simple practice created space for strategic thinking rather than reflexive accommodation. I learned to distinguish between constructive feedback and manipulative pressure. Constructive feedback came from people who had demonstrated genuine concern for my welfare and success, who provided specific observations rather than vague criticisms, and who respected my autonomy to accept or reject their suggestions. Manipulative pressure typically came from people who used emotional manipulation, who made vague accusations designed to trigger guilt, and who became hostile when their suggestions weren't immediately accepted. The fortress walls of San Miniato protected what was valuable inside while enabling strategic engagement with the outside world. My internal fortifications served the same purpose, protecting my core principles and priorities, while enabling me to engage strategically with others, rather than reactively accommodating everyone who demanded access to my decision-making processes. Once I had established internal fortifications, I faced a new challenge: how to build genuine relationships and alliances without falling back into people-pleasing patterns. The answer came through understanding that strong partnerships are built on mutual benefit and respect, not on one-sided accommodation and desperate approval-seeking. My education in strategic alliance building began when I observed how the most successful Italian city-states manage their relationships. Venice, in particular, had mastered the art of creating partnerships that served their interests while providing real value to their allies. They never begged for friendship, but they consistently delivered on their commitments and expected the same in return. I studied the treaty negotiations between Venice and the Ottoman Empire, which produced one of the most durable partnerships of the era. What struck me was how neither party tried to please the other at their own expense. Instead, they identified areas where their interests naturally aligned and structured their agreement around those mutual benefits. Venice gained access to eastern trade routes. The Ottomans gained a reliable European partner who wouldn't interfere with their expansion plans. This was fundamentally different from my previous approach to relationship building, where I had focused on being agreeable rather than being valuable. I had offered accommodation instead of competence, flexibility instead of reliability, eagerness instead of strategic partnership. I began experimenting with this new approach in my personal relationships within Florence's political circles. When Filippo Casavecchia, a fellow intellectual, suggested we collaborate on a project analyzing Roman military history, I didn't immediately agree out of desire to please him. Instead, I considered what I could genuinely contribute and what I hoped to gain from the partnership. I proposed a specific division of labor. Based on our respective strengths, he would handle the classical sources, while I would focus on contemporary military applications. I also established clear expectations about timelines, quality standards, and how we would handle disagreements. Rather than being offended by my directness, Filippo seemed relieved to work with someone who took the project seriously enough to establish professional boundaries. This collaboration proved far more productive than my previous people-pleasing relationships, which had typically involved me doing most of the work while being grateful for any recognition. By establishing mutual expectations and boundaries from the beginning, we created a partnership where both parties were genuinely invested in success. I learned that real allies prefer clarity to accommodation. When you clearly communicate your capabilities, limitations, and expectations, you give others the information they need to decide whether partnership makes sense for them. When you try to be everything to everyone, you provide no useful information and often create partnerships based on false assumptions. The strategic approach to alliance building also required developing what I called alliance criteria, standards, for determining which partnerships were worth pursuing. I began evaluating potential allies based on their competence, their reliability, their strategic value, and their respect for boundaries rather than simply their willingness to associate with me. This shift transformed my social and political relationships. Instead of a broad network of shallow connections maintained through constant accommodation, I developed a smaller circle of deeper partnerships based on mutual respect and genuine value exchange. These relationships proved far more durable and beneficial than my previous approach had ever produced. The treaty scroll became my symbol for this new approach, formal agreements between equals rather than desperate attempts to curry favor from those I perceived as superior. Perhaps the most controversial lesson I learned was the strategic value of what I came to call noble deception, the careful management of information and presentation that serves legitimate purposes without compromising essential integrity. The people-pleaser's naive transparency often serves no one well, while strategic discretion can protect everyone's genuine interests. This lesson came through watching the Venetian diplomatic corps, masters of what they called diplomatic discretion. During the War of the League of Cambrai, I observed how Venetian ambassadors managed information across multiple courts simultaneously. They weren't lying about their fundamental positions, but they were extraordinarily careful about timing, context, and audience when sharing information. I watched one Venetian envoy Andrea Gritti, navigate a particularly complex situation where Venice was negotiating with both France and the Holy Roman Empire simultaneously. When meeting with French representatives, he emphasized Venice's concerns about imperial expansion. When meeting with imperial representatives, he highlighted Venice's worries about French ambitions. He wasn't fabricating these concerns. Venice genuinely worried about both threats, but he was strategically emphasizing different aspects of Venice's position depending on his audience. This was radically different from my people-pleasing approach, where I had believed that total transparency was both morally superior and strategically wise. I had shared Florence's complete position with everyone, including our concerns, our limitations, and our internal disagreements. I thought this demonstrated honesty and good faith. Instead, it demonstrated naivety and poor judgment. By revealing everything to everyone, I had given our negotiating partners information they could use against us, while gaining nothing in return. My transparency hadn't built trust, it had invited manipulation. I began to understand that strategic discretion wasn't about deception, it was about professional competence. A physician doesn't share every detail of a patient's condition with everyone who asks, not because they're being deceptive, but because appropriate information sharing requires judgment about relevance, timing, and authority. The turning point came during my negotiations with Cardinal Francesco Soderini about papal support for Florence. Instead of immediately revealing all of Florence's concerns and limitations, I began by understanding what the Cardinal's priorities were and how Florence's interests might align with papal objectives. When he expressed concern about French influence in northern Italy, I focused our discussion on how Florentine independence served papal interests by preventing French domination of the region. I didn't mention Florence's separate concerns about imperial expansion or our internal debates about military spending, not because these were shameful secrets, but because they weren't relevant to building the specific partnership we were discussing. This approach proved far more effective than my previous method of sharing everything immediately. By managing the flow and timing of information strategically, I was able to build understanding around areas of genuine mutual interest, rather than getting distracted by irrelevant concerns or premature discussions of potential complications. I learned to distinguish between essential honesty and naive transparency. Essential honesty meant never making commitments I couldn't keep, never misrepresenting my authority or capabilities, and never promising outcomes I couldn't deliver. Naive transparency meant sharing every detail, concern, and internal process, regardless of relevance or timing. The Venetian mask became my symbol for this principle, not as a tool for hiding your true self, but as a means of presenting the aspects of yourself that serve the situation while protecting information that doesn't need to be shared immediately. Strategic discretion actually enabled more honest relationships because it allowed partnerships to develop around genuine mutual interests rather than getting derailed by irrelevant information or premature concerns about potential future complications. Asterisk. One of my most painful discoveries was recognizing that my people-pleasing tendencies had created what I came to call a mercenary mind, a psychology of dependence where my sense of worth, security, and direction came entirely from external validation rather than internal conviction. Like mercenary soldiers who fight for whoever pays them, I had been serving whoever offered approval, making me unreliable to everyone, including myself. This realization struck me during my study of Italy's mercenary companies, the condottieri, who sold their military services to the highest bidder. I had initially viewed these mercenaries with contempt, seeing them as unprincipled opportunists who switched sides based purely on financial advantage. But as I observed their behavior more closely, I recognized an uncomfortable parallel to my own political conduct. The mercenary captain who serves Florence today and Milan tomorrow isn't necessarily immoral. He's simply operating without deeper allegiance to any cause beyond his immediate compensation. His loyalty is transactional, conditional, and ultimately hollow because it serves no principle higher than his own immediate benefit. I realized I had been operating with a similar psychology. When Republican factions praised my work, I felt valuable and worthy. When Medici supporters showed approval, I basked in their validation. When foreign diplomats complimented my efforts, I felt successful and important. My sense of self-worth was entirely dependent on these external payments of approval, making me as unreliable as any hired sword. This mercenary mindset had infected every aspect of my decision-making. I would modify my positions, alter my recommendations, and even change my analysis based on which response was most likely to generate positive feedback. Like a mercenary who adjusts his fighting strategy based on who's paying him rather than what the tactical situation requires, I was adjusting my thinking based on who was evaluating me rather than what the evidence actually indicated. The most devastating aspect of this realization was understanding how it had made me genuinely incompetent, not just unprincipled. Mercenaries are notoriously unreliable in crucial battles. Because their commitment is conditional, when the situation becomes truly dangerous, they preserve themselves rather than serve their temporary employers. I had become equally unreliable in crucial political moments because my commitment to any position was conditional on continued approval. I began studying the alternative, leaders who operated from internal conviction rather than external validation. Francesco Sforza, the Duke of Milan, had actually begun his career as a mercenary but transformed himself into something quite different when he gained his own territory to defend. Once he had his own cause to serve, his behavior became predictable, reliable, and strategic in ways it had never been when he was simply serving others for payment. The key difference was that Sforza had developed what I came to call proprietary interest. He had something of his own to protect and advance rather than simply seeking approval from various masters. This gave him consistent criteria for making decisions and reliable motivation for seeing them through. I realized I needed to develop my own proprietary interests, principles, goals, and commitments that belonged to me rather than being borrowed from whoever was currently offering approval. This required a fundamental shift from asking what will make them happy with me to asking what do I actually believe serves the greater good. The process was more difficult than I had anticipated, because years of people-pleasing had atrophied my ability to form independent judgments. I had become so accustomed to taking cues from my environment that I had lost touch with my own analytical capabilities and moral intuitions. I began practicing independent analysis by writing private assessments of political situations without considering how anyone else might react to my conclusions. I forced myself to develop opinions based solely on evidence and logic, then tested whether those opinions remained consistent when I imagined various people's responses to them. The condottieri's contract became my symbol for this transformation. From serving whoever offered approval to serving principles and purposes I had consciously chosen to defend. My transformation from approval seeker to principled leader reached its culmination when I understood the true meaning of what I called the Republican ideal, not just a form of government, but a way of being that serves something larger than immediate personal comfort while maintaining individual dignity and autonomy. This ideal showed me how to escape the people-pleaser's trap of choosing between being selfish or being servile. The revelation came through studying the Roman Republic's greatest leaders, particularly figures like Cincinnatus, who accepted power when duty required it and relinquished it when the crisis passed. These leaders had discovered something that neither pure self-interest nor desperate people-pleasing could provide: a framework for making decisions based on principles that served the common good while maintaining personal integrity.
I
Realized that people-pleasing had never actually been about serving others. It had been about serving my own need for approval and security. My accommodation wasn't generosity. It was a sophisticated form of selfishness that used others' approval as a drug to manage my own insecurity. True service required the strength to disappoint people when their requests conflicted with larger principles or genuine needs. This insight transformed how I approached my relationships with Florence's leaders. Instead of automatically supporting whatever they wanted to hear, I began asking myself what would genuinely serve Florence's long-term interests, even if it meant delivering unwelcome news or recommending difficult decisions. When Piero asked for my assessment of Florence's military preparedness, my people-pleasing instinct was to provide reassuring analysis that would make him feel confident and grateful for my support. Instead, I forced myself to provide an honest evaluation. Florence's reliance on mercenary forces made us vulnerable to exactly the kind of betrayal that had destroyed other Italian city-states. The recommendation was unpopular because it implied expensive and difficult reforms, but it was accurate, and accuracy served Florence's interests better than my previous habit of telling leaders what they wanted to hear. When the military crisis eventually came, the leaders who had received honest analysis were better prepared than those who had been fed comfortable illusions. I learned that the Republican ideal required what I called principled independence, the ability to serve larger purposes without losing your autonomy to serve them effectively. This was different from both selfish individualism and self-negating people-pleasing. It required developing strong enough personal foundations to resist corruption while remaining committed enough to common purposes to make real sacrifices when necessary. The practical application meant learning to say both yes and no based on principled criteria rather than emotional reactions. When requests aligned with my core commitments and genuine expertise, I said yes wholeheartedly, bringing full energy and capability to the task. When requests conflicted with my principles or exceeded my competence, I said no clearly, often suggesting alternatives that might serve the requester's legitimate needs better. This approach initially confused people who were accustomed to my previous accommodating style. Some interpreted my new boundaries as arrogance or selfishness, but over time, those who worked with me regularly began to trust my judgment more, because they knew my recommendations were based on genuine analysis rather than desire for approval. The Florentine Constitution became my model for this approach's system of governance that balanced individual rights with collective responsibilities, that created structures for principled decision-making rather than mere power accumulation, and that served enduring values rather than temporary personalities. The Republican ideal taught me that true leadership means being willing to be unpopular when unpopularity serves the greater good, while remaining genuinely committed to that greater good rather than using principle as a mask for selfishness. The culmination of my transformation came when I realized I had become what I termed the new prince, not a ruler in the traditional sense, but someone who had mastered the art of self-governance and strategic influence that I would later codify in my famous work. The person who stops being a people-pleaser doesn't become a tyrant. They become a leader who commands respect through competence, consistency, and principled action. This transformation was tested during my involvement in organizing Florence's citizen militia, a project that required me to influence people without formal authority over them. The old Machiavelli would have tried to make the militia popular with everyone, seeking consensus before taking any action. The new prince I had become understood that effectiveness mattered more than universal approval. When wealthy Florentine merchants resisted contributing to the militia's funding, arguing that professional soldiers were more reliable than citizen volunteers, I didn't try to persuade them by making the project more convenient or less expensive. Instead, I made the case that Florence's independence required citizens who had personal stakes in the city's defense rather than mercenaries, whose loyalty was purely transactional. Some merchants remained unconvinced and continued their opposition. Rather than modifying the proposal to appease them, I focused my efforts on building support among those who understood the strategic necessity. I provided detailed analysis of how mercenary betrayals had destroyed other Italian cities, shared intelligence about growing external threats, and demonstrated how citizen militias had proven effective in Swiss cantons. The approach worked not because it pleased everyone, but because it served a genuine need with competent analysis and principled commitment. Those who supported the militia did so based on strategic understanding rather than personal accommodation, creating more durable and effective support than my previous people-pleasing methods had ever achieved. I had learned to lead through what I called principled authority, influence based on expertise, consistency, and genuine commitment to worthy objectives, rather than on desperation for approval or formal hierarchical power. This authority was more portable and reliable than either people-pleasing or positional power, because it was based on demonstrated competence and character. The transformation required mastering several key capabilities that I had never developed as a people-pleaser. First, I learned to make decisions based on strategic analysis rather than emotional reaction to others' responses. Second, I developed the ability to communicate unpopular truths in ways that served the audience's genuine interests rather than their immediate comfort. Third, I became skilled at building coalitions around shared objectives rather than personal relationships based on mutual accommodation. Most importantly, I learned to measure success by outcomes rather than approval ratings. When the militia project succeeded in providing Florence with more reliable defense capabilities, that success mattered more than whether everyone involved had enjoyed the process or appreciated my role in it. The crown of self-mastery that I had earned was invisible but real, the authority that comes from knowing your own principles, trusting your own judgment, and serving purposes larger than your immediate comfort. This authority couldn't be granted by others or taken away by their disapproval, because it was based on competence and character rather than position or popularity. The new prince I had become was someone who could influence situations and serve important purposes without needing permission, approval, or validation from others. This wasn't arrogance, it was the natural result of developing genuine expertise, principled commitment, and strategic thinking that served real needs, rather than manufactured desires for universal likability. Now let me share how these principles I learned in Renaissance Italy apply to the modern world you inhabit. Your workplace is simply another court. Your colleagues are courtiers, and the same dynamics of power, influence, and respect that determined success in my era continue to determine success in yours. The only difference is that modern people-pleasers often disguise their accommodation as professionalism or collaboration. I see your modern offices as perfect mirrors of the courts I once navigated. You have your equivalent of the Medici family senior executives who wield ultimate authority. You have your PayPal figures, regulatory bodies, and external stakeholders whose approval can make or break careers. You have your rival city-states competing, departments or companies vying for resources and recognition. Most importantly, you have the same fundamental choice I faced. You can spend your energy desperately seeking approval from everyone, making yourself valuable to no one, or you can learn to command respect through strategic thinking, principled positions, and consistent competence. Consider your modern equivalent of my diplomatic missions, the business meetings, where you're expected to represent your team's interests while maintaining relationships with other departments. The people-pleaser's approach is to seek solutions that make everyone comfortable. avoiding any position that might create tension or disappoint anyone. This approach fails for the same reasons it failed in Renaissance diplomacy. When you try to accommodate everyone's preferences simultaneously, you create solutions that serve no one's actual needs effectively. Your colleagues learn that your positions are negotiable based on social pressure rather than strategic analysis, making you unreliable as an ally and irrelevant as an opponent. The modern application of my principles begins with recognizing that your business card represents the same authority I once carried as Florence's envoy, the right and responsibility to represent specific interests competently and faithfully. But that authority only has value if you're willing to use it strategically rather than surrendering it for temporary approval. I watch modern professionals make the same mistakes I made as second chancellor. They agree to unrealistic deadlines to avoid disappointing their managers, then deliver poor quality work that disappoints everyone. They accept responsibility for projects beyond their expertise to appear helpful, then fail to deliver results that would actually help anyone. They avoid giving honest feedback to maintain comfortable relationships, then watch those relationships suffer when problems inevitably emerge. The strategic alternative requires applying the lion and fox principles to your professional interactions. Sometimes you must be direct about resource requirements, timeline constraints, or performance standards, even when that directness creates temporary discomfort. Sometimes you must be subtle about building support for necessary changes, positioning your initiatives within frameworks that serve your colleagues' stated objectives. Most modern people-pleasers are neither direct enough to command respect through strength nor strategic enough to build influence through positioning. They exist in the weak middle ground that serves no purpose effectively, just as I once did. The transformation begins with developing professional principles that guide your decisions regardless of who might approve or disapprove. These might include commitments to delivering quality work, even when shortcuts would be more popular, providing honest analysis, even when optimistic projections would be more welcome, or maintaining professional boundaries, even when accommodation would create temporary goodwill. Your modern court operates on the same principles of mutual benefit, strategic alliance, and earned respect that determines success in Renaissance Italy. The tools have changed, but human nature and the dynamics of power remain constant. Master these principles, and you'll find that commanding respect is far more satisfying and effective than desperately seeking approval. The final stage of your transformation requires establishing what I call the Republic of Self, an internal system of governance that operates according to consistent principles rather than the chaotic democracy of external opinions. Just as Florence needed constitutional structures to function effectively, you need internal structures that guide your decisions and behavior, regardless of the social pressures surrounding you. Your personal constitution must address the fundamental questions that every effective government addresses. What are your core values that remain non-negotiable? What processes will you use to make decisions when faced with competing demands? How will you handle conflicts between short-term social comfort and long-term strategic objectives? What criteria will determine when you say yes, when you say no, and when you seek more information before deciding? The people-pleaser operates without any such constitution, making decisions based purely on immediate social feedback. This creates the same chaos in personal governance that direct democracy creates in political governance. Decisions driven by whoever speaks loudest, whoever applies the most pressure, or whoever happens to be present when choices must be made. I learned to establish internal checks and balances that prevented any single influence from overwhelming my judgment. When someone requested my time, energy, or agreement, I created automatic processes for evaluation rather than automatic accommodation. I would ask myself, does this align with my stated priorities? Does this person have legitimate authority over this area of my life? Is this request based on genuine need or manipulative pressure? What would happen if I said no? These internal processes protected me from both people-pleasing and its opposite extreme, becoming reactive or defensive in response to any request. The goal wasn't to become selfish or uncooperative, but to become strategic and principled in my cooperation. The Republic of Self also required establishing what I called internal representation, making sure that my long-term interests, my core principles, and my authentic preferences had voices in my decision-making process, rather than being silenced by immediate social pressures. Too often, people-pleasers give overwhelming representation to external voices, while completely silencing their own needs and judgments. I developed the practice of formally consulting my internal constituencies before making significant commitments. I would ask, what does my long-term strategic thinking say about this opportunity? What do my core principles suggest about this request? What does my authentic assessment of my capabilities and interests indicate about my ability to deliver on this commitment? This internal consultation process often revealed conflicts between what would be immediately popular and what would serve my deeper objectives. The key was learning to resolve these conflicts strategically rather than automatically defaulting to external approval. The Republic of Self operates on the principle of enlightened self-governance, making decisions that serve your authentic, long-term interests while remaining genuinely committed to contributing value to others. This is fundamentally different from both people-pleasing, which serves others at the expense of your authentic self, and selfishness, which serves immediate, personal comfort at the expense of others. Sustainable relationships and effective contributions require this kind of internal governance. When you operate from clear principles and authentic capabilities, others can trust what you promise and rely on what you deliver. When you operate from desperate accommodation, you become unpredictable and ultimately unreliable to everyone, including yourself. The personal constitution you develop becomes your most valuable possession, a framework for maintaining your integrity and effectiveness. Regardless of the social pressures and changing circumstances you encounter throughout your life. As I prepare to leave you with these hard-won insights, I want you to understand the profound legacy you create when you stop being a people-pleaser and start commanding genuine respect. This transformation extends far beyond your immediate comfort or success. It changes the very fabric of how power and influence operate in your sphere of influence. When you refuse to participate in the conspiracy of approval-seeking, you give others permission to do the same. Your willingness to make principled decisions, to communicate honestly even when it's uncomfortable, and to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than desperate accommodation creates ripple effects that extend far beyond your personal experience. I have watched these ripples play out across centuries. The leaders who learned to govern themselves effectively became models for others who were trapped in cycles of people-pleasing. The principles I distilled from my own transformation have guided countless individuals toward more effective and fulfilling ways of engaging with power and influence. Your transformation matters not just for your own life, but for everyone who observes how you conduct yourself. When colleagues see that you can disagree respectfully without becoming hostile, that you can hold boundaries without becoming selfish, that you can serve important purposes without sacrificing your integrity, they begin to imagine new possibilities for their own behavior. The sealed testament I leave with you contains these final principles. First, remember that respect must be earned through consistent competence and character, never through accommodation or manipulation. Those who try to shortcut this process through people-pleasing discover that the respect they thought they had gained was actually just polite tolerance that disappears under pressure. Second, understand that your capacity to serve others effectively depends entirely on your commitment to serving your authentic principles and capabilities. When you betray your own judgment to please external audiences. You lose access to the very insights and abilities that make you valuable to others. Third, recognize that sustainable influence requires strategic thinking about relationships, timing, and objectives, rather than emotional reactions to immediate social feedback. The leader who responds to every pressure immediately will be controlled by those pressures rather than directing them toward productive outcomes. Finally, accept that transformation from people pleaser to respected leader is not a destination but an ongoing practice. You will face constant temptations to return to accommodation and approval-seeking, especially when those approaches seem easier or more immediately comfortable than principled action. The strength you develop through this practice compounds over time. Each principled decision makes the next one easier. Each boundary you maintain with dignity makes others respect your future boundaries more readily. Each time you provide honest value instead of desperate accommodation, you build reputation and relationships that serve larger purposes. I challenge you to carry forward what I have shared not as a set of techniques for personal advancement, but as principles for creating the kind of influence that serves genuine progress rather than mere personal comfort. The world needs leaders who can think strategically, communicate honestly, and serve important purposes without needing constant validation. Your legacy will be determined not by how much approval you gathered, but by how much authentic value you created through principled action. Make it worthy of the transformation you have undertaken.